Welcome to the Drowsy Economist. I'm glad you found your way here tonight. This is a space where we explore the structures that shape our economic world, not with urgency or alarm, but with the kind of quiet, unhurried attention that invites your mind to settle. Tonight, we'll be moving through the subject of government debt, how nations borrow money, how that borrowing is organized, administered, and carried forward across years and decades, slowly, gently, from the very beginning. Before there were bonds, before there were treasury departments, before there were auctions and payment schedules, all the way forward to the invisible systems that operate right now, in the background, while most of the world sleeps. There's nothing here that needs to be memorized. No test at the end. If you find yourself learning something along the way, that's wonderful. If instead you find yourself drifting off into peaceful sleep, that's equally wonderful. There is no wrong way to experience this. And now, let us begin. There is a road not far from where you grew up. You may not have thought about it in years. It's just a road. Pavement, painted lines, maybe a median with grass that gets cut a few times each summer. You've driven it, or walked alongside it, or crossed it without looking up from your phone. It's simply there, the way roads are there, the way sidewalks and lampposts and drainage systems are there, present, functional, unremarkable. But someone built it. And before someone built it, someone planned it. Drew it on paper, measured distances, calculated how wide the lanes needed to be, decided where the traffic signals would go. And before any of that, someone had to determine how the building would be paid for. Not just who would pay, but when, and how the money would arrive, and what would happen in the meantime between the decision to build and the actual collection of the funds that would cover the cost. This is where the story of government debt begins, not in a financial institution, not in a conference room where economists are studying charts. It begins on a road, on a bridge, in a building that needs a new roof, in the space between when something needs to be done and when the money to do it fully exists. Governments have been navigating that space for a very long time. If you think about any large public project, a highway that stretches across a mountain range, a water treatment facility that serves a city of 1 million people, a network of bridges connecting an island to a mainland, the one thing all of those projects share is that they take time. They take years, sometimes. The planning happens. The permits are obtained. The contractors are selected. The materials are ordered. Workers show up every morning for months. For years, doing the slow and methodical work of building something permanent. And throughout all of that time, money is flowing outward. Salaries are being paid. Equipment is being purchased. Fuel is being used. Supplies are being delivered. The costs accumulate week by week, steadily and without pause. Meanwhile, the taxes that will eventually help cover those costs are also accumulating, but on their own schedule. They come in quarterly, annually, irregularly. A government might collect a significant portion of its tax revenue in the spring, when personal tax filings come due, and then spend the rest of the year managing the gap between what came in and what continues to go out. This mismatch between the moment when spending is needed and the moment when revenue arrives is one of the most fundamental facts of public finance. It is not a crisis or a failure of planning. It is simply the nature of large-scale administration. The needs of a public system do not pause and wait for the treasury to fill, and so governments, like most entities that manage large and ongoing expenses, borrow. The borrowing takes many forms, and we will come to those forms gradually, but the underlying logic is simple enough that it would be recognizable to almost anyone who has ever taken out a loan to pay for something they needed before they had quite enough money saved. You borrow from someone who has the money available now. You agree to pay it back later. You pay a little extra, an amount called interest, in exchange for the ability to use the money sooner. The lender gets a return. You get the funds when you need them. The project gets built. When a government does this, the scale is larger. The formality is greater. The paperwork, as you might imagine, is considerably more involved. But the underlying logic remains. Borrowing allows a government to act now and pay later, smoothing out the inevitable unevenness between when money is needed and when money arrives. Let's stay with the ordinary world a little longer before we move into the financial details. Think about a public school, not a grand one necessarily, just an ordinary building somewhere in a mid-sized town with classrooms and a cafeteria and a gymnasium that gets used for assemblies and basketball games and indoor recess when it's too cold to go outside. A school like that was built at some point. The town decided it was needed. Families had moved in. Enrollment was rising. The old building was too small, or too old, or in a neighborhood that no longer made geographic sense. And so the town decided to build. The cost of a school building, the kind of simple, functional building that towns and cities build every year, all across the country, might be somewhere in the range of $20 or $30 million, depending on size and location and the cost of materials at the time. That is a significant sum for most towns. Not extraordinary in the context of government finance, but significant. A town with an annual budget of, say, $80 million cannot simply set aside 20% of everything it collects for 3 years and then build the school. The daily business of running a town continues regardless. The roads need ploughing in winter. The water system needs maintenance. The fire department needs its budget. The employees need their salaries. So the town borrows. It issues what is called a bond. We will explain bonds in much more detail as we move through tonight's narration. But at the simplest level, a bond is a promise to pay back a specific amount of money at a specific time in the future, with a specific amount of interest paid along the way. Someone, a bank, a pension fund, a private investor, perhaps another government, agrees to lend the town the money it needs to build the school. In exchange, the town agrees to pay that lender back over time in regular installments with interest. The school gets built. Children attend. Teachers teach. Years pass. And quietly in the background, the town continues making its payments, a little each year like a mortgage on the building, until the debt is retired. This is the basic architecture of government borrowing, and it is replicated at every level of public administration. Towns, cities, counties, states, provinces, and national governments all engage in some version of this same process. The scale changes, the formality changes, the types of instruments used change. But the essential logic, borrow now, build now, repay over time, remains consistent throughout. There is something reassuring about that consistency, if you let yourself notice it. All of this complexity, the bonds, the auctions, the payment schedules, the treasury operations, is, at its heart, just an elaborately organized system for managing the timing of public money. Money that will come from somewhere and go towards something and eventually be accounted for. The elaborateness is necessary given the scale, but underneath it the purpose is not so different from the ordinary financial decisions that households and businesses make every day. Now, let us begin to move very slowly toward the financial machinery itself. We'll start with a question that seems simple but turns out to have a rather interesting answer. Why do governments borrow money at all? The answer that comes first to most people is because they spend more than they take in. And that is often true. Many governments in many years collect less in taxes than they spend on services and programs and infrastructure and administration. The difference between what comes in and what goes out when spending is higher is called a deficit. And deficits, when they accumulate over time, become what we call the national debt. But that is not the only reason governments borrow. Even a government that collects enough in taxes to cover its total spending might still borrow for specific purposes, because the timing of revenue and the timing of expenditure do not always align. Taxes come in at certain points in the year. Spending happens all year, continuously without pause. And certain large investments, infrastructure projects, capital improvements, long-term development programs are best financed over the same long periods that they are expected to deliver benefits. A road that will serve a community for 40 years makes some reasonable financial sense to pay for over 40 years. The people who drive that road in 20 years will contribute to its cost through the taxes and other mechanisms that support the ongoing debt service. There is a certain logic to spreading the cost of a long-lived asset across the life of that asset. It is the same logic that makes a 30-year mortgage for a house a generally sensible way for most families to purchase a home. You will live there for decades. You will pay for it over decades. Governments apply a version of this logic to public investments, and so borrowing becomes not just a response to shortfalls, but a deliberate financial strategy, a way of matching the timing of payment to the timing of benefit. This does not resolve every question about government borrowing. There are reasonable debates, which we will not be having tonight, about how much borrowing is appropriate, and for what purposes, and at what cost. Those are important conversations, but they are not our conversation. Our conversation is simply about how the machinery works, how governments borrow, and what the instruments they use look like, and how the systems that administer all of this are organized and maintained over time. We will get to all of that. But first, a moment to rest in the image of that road, the pavement stretching ahead of you in the dark, the painted lines slipping under the headlights, the gentle hum of the engine and the ordinary miracle of infrastructure, all of it financed, all of it administered, all of it quietly tended to by systems that were built over many years by people who figured out, piece by piece, how to manage the slow and permanent business of paying for the things that the public needs. The night is long. We are in no hurry. There is a particular kind of quiet that settles over a government office in the early morning. Not a dramatic quiet, Not the kind of quiet that signals that something is about to happen, just the ordinary quiet of a place that has not yet filled with people. Fluorescent lights humming faintly above long rows of desks, the smell of old paper and carpet, and the particular institutional neutrality that public buildings accumulate over years of use. These are the offices where the paperwork of public finance gets done. Not the decisions about how much to spend and on what and when. Those happen in other rooms with other people, in the language of politics and policy. What happens in these quieter offices is different. What happens here is the administration of those decisions, the processing of the forms, the maintenance of the ledgers, the sending and receiving of the documents that make borrowing, government borrowing, an organized and repeatable activity rather than a chaotic improvisation. We are going to spend some time in those offices tonight. Not literally, of course, but in the spirit of them. We are going to look at the systems that were built, slowly and over a very long time, to manage the practical reality that governments sometimes need to spend money before they have it, and that other people are willing to lend that money, and that this arrangement, this lending and borrowing, needs to be administered carefully and consistently if it is to function at all. The word that sits at the centre of all of this is one you have heard before: bond. A government bond is, at its most basic, a document that records a promise. The government is promising to pay back a specific amount of money, called the principal, at a specific future date, and it is promising, in addition, to make regular smaller payments along the way, called interest, or sometimes called coupon payments, after the old paper coupons that bondholders used to clip and mail in to receive their payments. That is essentially the whole structure: principal, interest, and a date. Everything else, the auctions, the secondary markets, the treasury departments, the ratings and the yields, and the elaborate financial scaffolding that surrounds government debt, is built on top of that simple three-part promise. Let's take it slowly. The principal is the amount being borrowed. If a government issues a bond with a principal of $1,000, it is borrowing $1,000 from whoever buys that bond. On the date the bond matures, the date when the loan is due to be repaid, the government will pay the bondholder back that $1,000. The principal, the original sum. The interest is the cost of borrowing, the extra amount that gets paid over time in exchange for the use of the money. If the bond pays 2% interest per year and the bond has a 10-year term, then the government will pay $20 each year, 2% of $1,000, to the bondholder. At the end of 10 years, the bondholder will have received $200 in interest payments, and then the original $1,000 returned. Total received, $1,200. Total cost to the government, $200 spread across a decade, in exchange for the use of $1,000 for that entire period. This is a straightforward enough arrangement. It resembles, in structure, almost any other kind of loan. The person who has money lends it to the person who needs money. Interest is charged. The loan is repaid. The lender earns a return. The borrower gets the use of funds that would otherwise not have been available. What makes government bonds different from most other kinds of loans is not the structure. It is the scale, the formality, and, in the case of stable national governments, the general expectation that the loans will be repaid. When a large established national government issues bonds, investors around the world generally treat those bonds as among the safest available investments. Not because governments are infallible, they are not, but because national governments have access to resources and mechanisms that most borrowers do not. They can raise taxes. They can adjust spending. They have, in most cases, been operating as borrowers for many decades or centuries and have built up a long record of meeting their financial obligations. This expectation of repayment is what allows governments to borrow at relatively low rates of interest. If you are seen as a very reliable borrower, lenders will accept a lower return in exchange for the safety of lending to you. If you are seen as a less reliable borrower, lenders will demand higher interest payments to compensate for the additional risk of lending to you. The relationship between risk and return is one of the most consistent patterns in all of finance, and it applies to government borrowing just as it applies to everything else. But we are getting slightly ahead of ourselves. Let us return to the bond itself and look at a few of its variations. Governments do not issue just one kind of bond. They issue several, distinguished primarily by how long the borrowing lasts, the term or maturity of the debt. The shortest term instruments are often called treasury bills, or sometimes just T-bills. These are borrowing arrangements with very short lifespans, weeks or a few months. A government might issue a treasury bill that matures in 4 weeks or 13 weeks or 6 months. The amounts can be large. Governments deal in millions and billions, but the time period is brief. Treasury bills are used to manage the short-term gaps in cash flow that any large organization experiences. Revenue is coming in, spending is going out, and in the gaps between, treasury bills help bridge the difference. Because treasury bills mature so quickly, they work slightly differently than longer-term bonds. Rather than paying periodic interest, treasury bills are typically sold at a discount. A government might sell a treasury bill for $990 that will pay back $1,000 in 90 days. The difference, the $10 discount, is effectively the interest earned by the buyer. Simple, brief, functional. The medium-term instruments are often called treasury notes. These typically have maturities of somewhere between 2 and 10 years. They pay regular interest, semi-annually, in many systems, and return the principal at maturity. They sit in the middle of the spectrum, not as quick and liquid as treasury bills, but not as long a commitment as the longest-term bonds. And then there are the long-term bonds, sometimes called treasury bonds, sometimes simply long bonds, which can have maturities of 20 or 30 years. These are the instruments that governments use when they want to lock in long-term financing for long-term purposes. Infrastructure, for example. A government building a major bridge or tunnel or water system might want to finance that project with 20-year or 30-year debt, matching the repayment schedule to the useful life of what was built. Long-term bonds also serve a particular purpose for certain kinds of investors. Pension funds, insurance companies, and other institutions that have long-term obligations of their own, payments they know they will need to make decades from now, often want to hold assets that will deliver stable, predictable income over equally long periods. A 30-year government bond matches that need rather well. The fund buys the bond, collects interest for 3 decades, and receives the principal back just around the time it needs to start distributing retirement payments to an aging group of beneficiaries. The interests of the borrower and the lender align in a useful way. This alignment between what the government needs and what certain investors need is part of what makes the market for government bonds function as smoothly as it does most of the time. There is a real demand for these instruments from real institutions with real long-term needs, and governments have learned over time to structure their borrowing in ways that meet that demand. Let us pause here for a moment and take in the overall shape of what we have covered so far. A government needs to spend money. The money it needs is not always available at exactly the moment it is needed, either because tax revenue arrives unevenly, or because the project being funded is too large to cover from existing reserves, or because it makes financial sense to spread the cost across the time period during which the benefit will be felt. And so the government borrows. It borrows by issuing bonds, which are promises to repay, with interest at a future date. The bonds come in different forms, from short-term treasury bills to medium-term notes to long-term bonds, each suited to different purposes and different kinds of investors. The interest paid on these bonds is the cost of borrowing, a cost that varies depending on how the government's creditworthiness is perceived, and how long the borrowing lasts and what conditions are prevailing in the broader financial world at the time. That is the foundation. What we have not yet looked at is how specifically these bonds get sold. How does a government take the idea of a bond, this promise, this 3-part document recording principal and interest and maturity date, and actually get it into the hands of investors? How does the transaction happen? The answer is through a process called an auction. Government bond auctions are, in their way, among the most orderly and routine financial events that occur in any given week. They happen on a regular schedule, sometimes daily, sometimes weekly, sometimes at longer intervals depending on the country and the type of instrument being sold. They are announced in advance, the terms are published, and eligible participants, banks, financial institutions, certain qualified investors, submit bids indicating how much they are willing to pay and how many bonds they want to buy. The auction process varies in its specifics from country to country, but the general outline is consistent. The government announces that it will be selling a certain quantity of bonds. Bidders submit their offers. The government accepts bids, starting from the most favourable and working down, until it has raised the amount it set out to raise. The bonds are sold. The money flows to the government, and the new bondholders settle in to wait for their first interest payment. There is something almost placid about the regularity of it. Every week, or close to it somewhere in the world, a government is selling bonds. The calendars are published, the amounts are forecasted. The participants know when to expect the next auction, and the one after that, and the one after that. The machinery runs, and the money, once raised, goes to work. It pays the salaries of teachers and soldiers and road maintenance crews. It funds the construction of the bridge and the renovation of the courthouse and the installation of the new water filtration system. It covers the gap between when tax revenue is expected and when it arrives. It is, in the most literal sense, the financial infrastructure that underlies the physical infrastructure, the money that allows the concrete and steel and electrical cables to exist. It is worth sitting with that for a moment. Every piece of public infrastructure that you encounter in daily life, the road, yes, but also the hospital and the park, and the public transit system, and the network of pipes that delivers clean water to your tap. Each of those things was paid for somehow, and in most cases some portion of the payment came from borrowed money, from bonds, from someone, somewhere, who was willing to lend to a government and wait patiently for repayment while the thing being funded was built and used and maintained and eventually handed down to the next generation. There is a long chain of these transactions stretching back through history. Governments borrowing to do things, investors lending in exchange for a return, interest being paid year after year in quiet installments, principal being returned eventually at maturity, and new bonds being issued on a rolling basis to replace the old ones and fund the new projects. The chain does not often announce itself, it simply continues. And tonight we will follow it a little further. Let us return to the auction. We mentioned it toward the end of the last section. This idea that governments sell their bonds through a regular, scheduled, orderly process rather than something more improvised or reactive. It is worth spending more time here because the auction is where the idea of a bond becomes an actual transaction. It is the moment when the promise gets exchanged for the funds, the moment when the borrowing truly begins. The way a government bond auction works, in most large economies, goes something like this. The Treasury, the department of government responsible for managing public finances, announces well in advance that it intends to sell a certain quantity of bonds. It specifies the type. Treasury bills, perhaps, maturing in 13 weeks, or notes with a 5-year term, or longer bonds with a 20 or 30-year maturity. It specifies the total amount it hopes to raise, and it sets a date. This announcement is not a surprise to anyone in the financial system. The major economies publish their borrowing calendars months ahead of time. Market participants, banks, investment funds, financial institutions know when the next auction is coming. They plan around it. They decide in advance how much they want to bid for and at what terms. There is a rhythm to it that, once established, becomes almost automatic. The government announces. The participants prepare. The auction occurs. The bonds are sold. On the day itself, eligible participants submit their bids. In many systems, there are 2 broad categories of bidders. Competitive bidders specify both a price and a quantity. They are saying, in effect, I am willing to buy this many bonds, but only if the yield is at least this favourable to me. A yield in bond terms is the effective rate of return the buyer receives, which is related to, but not identical to, the stated interest rate on the bond. We will come to that relationship in a moment. For now, the important thing is that competitive bidders are expressing a preference. They want a certain return, and they are willing to walk away if the terms are not right. Non-competitive bidders, by contrast, agree in advance to accept whatever yield results from the auction. They are saying, I want this quantity of bonds, and I will take whatever rate the market settles on. Non-competitive bids are more common among smaller investors and institutions that prioritize certainty of purchase, over optimization of return. They want to know they will receive the bonds. They are less focused on squeezing out every last fraction of a percentage point. Once all the bids are in, the Treasury works through them, starting from the most favourable competitive bids, the ones willing to accept the lowest yield, meaning the cheapest borrowing for the government, and working downward. The Treasury accepts bids until the total quantity of bonds it planned to sell has been fully subscribed. The yield at which the last accepted bid comes in is typically the yield that all successful bidders receive. Everyone who bid at or above that threshold gets their bonds at the same rate. The result is announced. The bonds are issued. The money flows into government accounts, and the new bondholders receive their securities, their formal, recorded claim on the government's future interest payments and eventual principal repayment. It is, by any ordinary measure, a quiet and procedural event. No opening bell, no trading floor, no voices raised in negotiation. In many modern systems, the entire process is conducted electronically, with bids submitted through secure terminals and results calculated and published within minutes of the auction's close. The whole thing can feel, from the outside, like a very large and very routine administrative task, which, in a sense, is exactly what it is. And yet the scale of what moves through these auctions is genuinely difficult to comprehend in everyday terms. A single auction for a large national government might raise several $billion in a single afternoon. Across a year, the cumulative borrowing of a major economy through these auctions can reach into the hundreds of billions. The individual auction is quiet and procedural. The aggregate is enormous. Now, once the bonds have been issued through the auction, something interesting happens. The bondholders do not necessarily hold on to them until maturity. This is where a secondary market enters the picture. A secondary market is simply a market where things that have already been sold once get bought and sold again, and again, and again between parties who were not involved in the original transaction. You may be familiar with the concept from other contexts. A used car market is a secondary market. A resale ticket market is a secondary market. The stock market, for the most part, is a secondary market. People buying and selling shares that were originally issued by companies. Not buying new shares from the company itself every time. Government bonds have a very active secondary market. Once a bond has been issued through an auction, it can be bought and sold among investors freely until the day it matures. This ability to sell a bond before it reaches maturity is one of the features that makes bonds attractive to many investors. You are not necessarily locked in for 30 years when you buy a 30-year bond. If your circumstances change, or if a better opportunity presents itself, or if you simply decide you would rather have the cash, you can sell the bond to another buyer on the secondary market. The price you will receive depends on conditions at that moment, how much time remains until maturity, what interest rates look like now compared to when the bond was issued, and how much demand there is among other investors for that particular bond. These prices move. They can move a great deal over the life of a long bond, but through it all, the bond itself, the underlying promise from the government to pay interest and eventually return the principal, remains exactly what it was when it was first issued. The promise does not change. Only the price at which the promise changes hands fluctuates. This distinction between the original promise and the secondary market price is worth holding in mind, because it helps explain one of the things that sometimes confuses people about bonds: the relationship between bond prices and yields. When a bond is issued at auction, it carries a stated interest rate, the coupon rate. If a bond with a face value of $1,000 carries a 2% coupon, it will pay $20 per year in interest every year until it matures. That is fixed. It does not change. But on the secondary market, the bond itself can be bought and sold at prices above or below that original face value. If interest rates in the broader economy have risen since the bond was issued, meaning newer bonds are now paying, say, 3%, then the older bond paying 2% becomes less attractive. No one will pay full price for something that yields less than the current alternatives. The price of the older bond falls until it reaches a level where its effective yield, taking into account the discounted purchase price, matches what the market is offering for newer bonds. Conversely, if interest rates have fallen, if new bonds are now paying only 1%, then the older bond paying 2% becomes quite attractive. Investors will pay more than face value to get their hands on it. The price rises. This is the relationship at the heart of bond markets. When prices go up, yields go down. When prices go down, yields go up. They move in opposite directions always. It is an arithmetic inevitability, not a matter of opinion or interpretation. And it is the reason that the secondary market for bonds, quiet as it often seems from the outside, is in constant gentle motion. Prices adjusting, yields shifting, the whole system calibrating itself continuously to reflect the current state of interest rates and investor demand. We do not need to go deeper into those mechanics tonight. The secondary market is a large and detailed subject, and we are here primarily to understand the basic architecture of government borrowing, not to become fluent in bond trading. What matters for our purposes is simply this: bonds can be bought and sold after they are issued, and their prices reflect the ongoing relationship between the bond's fixed promise and the ever-changing conditions of the broader financial world. The government, meanwhile, is largely indifferent to these secondary market movements. The Treasury borrowed a specific amount at a specific cost through the auction, and it will service that debt, pay the interest, return the principal, according to the terms it agreed to on the day of issuance. What happens to the bond after that, in the hands of secondary market participants, does not change the government's obligations. The promise was made once, at auction, and it stands regardless of how many times the bond subsequently changes hands. There is something almost restful about that stability. In a financial world that is otherwise in constant motion, the government's obligation on a bond is one of the fixed points. The payment dates are set. The amounts are known. The schedule will be honoured. Whatever else is happening, in markets, in economies, in the broader world, the Treasury will send the interest payment on the appointed day. And it is this reliability, this steady, predictable, somewhat plodding faithfulness to the schedule that makes government bonds attractive to the particular kinds of investors who buy and hold them. Let us spend some time now with those investors, because understanding who buys government bonds and why adds an important dimension to the picture we are building. The buyers of government bonds are, in the main, not individuals. They are institutions, large, patient, long-horizon institutions that manage money on behalf of others, and that have particular needs when it comes to the kinds of assets they hold. Pension funds are among the most significant buyers of government bonds in most economies. A pension fund is an institution that collects contributions from workers and employers over the course of people's working lives, invests that money, and then distributes it as retirement income when those workers eventually stop working. The timelines involved are very long. Someone who starts contributing to a pension fund at 25 might not begin drawing from it until 65, a 40-year horizon. The fund needs to hold assets that will reliably deliver value over those decades, without exposing the retirement savings of its beneficiaries to more risk than is prudent. Government bonds suit this need rather well. They pay a known rate of interest at regular intervals. They return a known amount at a known future date. They are backed by a national government. They can be planned around. A pension fund that needs to make a certain level of payments to retirees in 20 years can buy bonds maturing in 20 years and know, with a high degree of confidence, that the money will be there. Insurance companies hold significant quantities of government bonds for similar reasons. An insurance company collects premiums from policyholders and holds them in reserve against the possibility of future claims. Those reserves need to be invested in something safe and predictable, something that will not disappear in value just when a large claim arrives. Government bonds fill that role. They are the financial equivalent of a very well-organized filing cabinet. Not exciting, but exactly where you need it to be, when you need it. Central banks, the institutions responsible for managing a country's money supply and overseeing its financial system, also hold government bonds, often in very large quantities. This is part of how central banks conduct monetary policy, buying and selling government bonds in the open market as a way of influencing the amount of money circulating in the economy and the general level of interest rates. When a central bank buys bonds, it puts money into circulation. When it sells bonds, it pulls money out. The government bond market is, in this sense, one of the primary channels through which monetary policy operates, a fact that ties the world of government borrowing very closely to the broader management of the economy. Commercial banks also hold government bonds as part of their required reserves and as a way of managing their own liquidity. A bank that needs to hold a certain portion of its assets in safe, easily sold form will often keep a significant share of those assets in government bonds. They are liquid, easily bought and sold on the secondary market, and they are considered among the safest assets available. For a bank that needs to balance safety, liquidity, and return, government bonds occupy a very natural and enduring place in the portfolio. And then there are foreign governments and foreign central banks, which hold the bonds of other nations as part of managing their own foreign currency reserves. When a country accumulates foreign currency, through trade surpluses for instance, when it exports more than it imports, it needs somewhere to keep those funds. Holding them in the bonds of a large, stable foreign government is one common approach. The funds earn a modest return, they remain relatively safe, and they can be converted back to cash relatively easily if needed. The result of all this is that the market for government bonds is genuinely vast, populated by a large and diverse collection of institutions, each with its own reasons for being there, each contributing to the deep pool of demand that allows governments to borrow reliably and at predictable costs. And it is that depth of demand and that steady, persistent appetite for the safe and predictable returns that government bonds provide that gives the whole system its particular quality of quiet durability. The auction happens, the bonds are sold, the institutions settle in to hold them, the interest payments arrive on schedule, and in the background, almost invisibly, the financial machinery of public borrowing turns and turns, as it has for a very long time. The night continues. We will go a little further still. There is a distinction that comes up often in conversations about government finance, and it is one worth pausing on, not because it is complicated, but because the two terms involved are frequently used interchangeably when they mean quite different things. The distinction is between a deficit and a debt. A deficit is a single year's shortfall. It is the difference, in any given fiscal year, between what a government spends and what it collects in revenue. If a government takes in $800 billion in taxes and other income and spends $1 trillion on all of its programs and obligations and operations, the deficit for that year is $200 billion. It borrowed that $200 billion to cover the gap. The deficit belongs to that year. It describes what happened during that particular period of time. The debt is something different. The debt is the accumulation, the running total of all the borrowing a government has done over all the years it has run deficits, minus whatever it has paid back over the years it managed to run surpluses. A government that runs deficits year after year adds to its total debt each year. A government that runs a surplus, collecting more than it spends, can use that surplus to pay down some of the accumulated debt. The debt is the sum of history. It does not reset at the end of the fiscal year. It carries forward indefinitely until it is retired. Think of it this way. If you imagine a bathtub with water in it, the total water in the tub at any given moment is the debt. The deficit is how much water you added this year, the flow of the tap during the current period. A surplus would be how much water you drained. The level in the tub right now reflects everything that has ever flowed in and everything that has ever drained out, all the way back to when you first turned on the tap. This distinction matters because the two numbers tell very different stories. A deficit tells you something about the current year's fiscal position, whether the government spent more or less than it brought in during this particular cycle. The debt tells you something about the government's entire accumulated financial history, the total weight of all past borrowing that has not yet been repaid. Both numbers are real, and both are relevant to understanding government finances, but they are not the same number, and conflating them, treating them as though they describe the same thing, can lead to confusion about what is actually happening in the financial life of a public institution. Governments carry debt, in most cases across very long stretches of time. Some of the debt that national governments currently carry was originally incurred decades ago for infrastructure built in the middle of the last century, for programs established long before most current taxpayers were born, for obligations that were taken on by administrations that have long since ended and been replaced by others. The debt persists even as the governments that created it change and evolve. It is one of the ways that the financial decisions of the past remain present in the budgets of today. This is not necessarily a problem. It is in many ways simply the nature of large institutional borrowing. The obligations were taken on, the benefits were received, the schools were built, the bridges were crossed, the services were delivered, and the debt that financed those things continues to be serviced year after year through interest payments that appear as a line in every annual budget. That line, the interest payment, is, in one sense, the most direct and tangible manifestation of accumulated government debt in the daily life of public finance. It is money that must be paid reliably and on schedule, regardless of what else is happening in the budget. The schools and hospitals and defense programs and pension payments can all be debated and adjusted and negotiated. But the interest payments on outstanding bonds are contractual obligations. They are the price of the borrowing, and they must be honoured. This is why the total level of accumulated debt and the interest rate at which it was borrowed matters over time. A government that has borrowed a very large amount at relatively high interest rates will find that a significant portion of its annual revenue is committed to interest payments before it has made a single decision about how to spend anything else. The interest is the first claim on the available funds. And this is also why the general level of interest rates in the economy matters so much to government finances, not just for new borrowing, but for the ongoing cost of existing debt. When a bond matures and the government needs to issue new debt to replace it, it does so at whatever interest rates prevail at that moment. If rates have risen significantly since the original bond was issued, the new borrowing will be more expensive. If rates have fallen, it will be cheaper. The government's interest costs in this way are always in some relationship with the broader interest rate environment. Not all at once, because bonds have fixed terms and do not reprice overnight, but gradually, as old bonds mature and new ones are issued to replace them. This process of replacing old debt with new debt is called refinancing, or, in the particular language of government finance, rolling over the debt. It is worth understanding because it is one of the most important and least visible routines of public financial administration. When a government bond reaches its maturity date, the government must pay back the principal. The full face value of the bond returned to whoever holds it at that moment. For a bond issued 10 years ago with a face value of $1 billion, that means $1 billion flowing out of the treasury on a specific day. Most governments do not have $1 billion sitting idle in an account, waiting for that moment. They are not, in general, holding cash reserves of sufficient size to simply write a check and retire each piece of debt as it comes due. They are large, complex institutions with continuous inflows of tax revenue and continuous outflows of spending, and they manage their cash positions dynamically, not by stockpiling. What they do instead is issue new bonds. They borrow again. New bonds are sold at auction. The proceeds are used to pay off the maturing bonds. The debt, in effect, is extended, rolled forward in time, continued, maintained. The total amount outstanding may stay approximately the same, or grow, or shrink, depending on whether the new issuance is larger or smaller than the amount being retired. but the mechanism is the same. Old bonds are paid off with the proceeds of new bonds. This rolling over of debt is a routine, ongoing activity for every large national government. At any given moment, a government has bonds of many different maturities coming due at different points in the future, some maturing next month, some next year, some in 5 years, some in 20 or 30. The Treasury manages all of these maturity dates, plans ahead for the refinancing that each one will require, and coordinates its issuance calendar accordingly. Managing the maturity profile of the national debt, the distribution of when various bonds come due, is itself a form of financial strategy. A government that has allowed too much of its debt to mature at the same time faces a large and sudden need to refinance a great deal of borrowing at once in whatever market conditions happen to prevail at that moment. A government that has spread its maturities more evenly across time can refinance more gradually, in smaller amounts, with more flexibility about timing. The discipline of managing that distribution, of not letting too much come due at once, of maintaining a balanced and manageable schedule, is one of the quiet skills of Treasury management. It is the kind of skill that rarely makes news. There are no announcements when a government successfully manages its maturity profile with particular elegance. The bonds mature, the new bonds are issued, the payments are made. Everything proceeds on schedule as it was designed to do. The absence of disruption is the measure of success, and absences by their nature go largely unreported. Let us sit with that thought for a moment, the idea that a great deal of the most important work in public financial administration is precisely the kind of work that, when done well, generates no headlines at all. The payment that arrives on time, the auction that is fully subscribed, the maturity that is smoothly refinanced, the schedule that continues to be met, these are not stories. They are simply facts, quiet, procedural facts that accumulate over time into something that looks, from the outside, like stability. And stability in public finance is not a small thing. It is, in many ways, the thing that everything else depends on. The pension funds that hold government bonds are counting on it. The insurance companies are counting on it. The foreign central banks managing their reserves are counting on it. The ordinary functioning of the broader financial system, the confidence that money lent to a government will be returned, rests on this accumulated, unremarkable record of payments made and obligations honoured. It's a record built not in a single dramatic moment, but in the repetition of ordinary administrative acts, carried out week after week, quarter after quarter, year after year, by the people who work in those quiet government offices with the fluorescent lights and the long rows of desks, and the institutional smell of paper and carpet. The debt continues, the payments continue, the auctions continue, and the system, which was built slowly and deliberately over a very long time, continues to function, imperfectly as all large systems do, but persistently, with a kind of institutional inertia that makes it remarkably durable. There is more to explore. The machinery goes deeper still, and we will follow it a little further before the night is done. There is a department within most national governments that does not often come up in ordinary conversation. It goes by different names in different countries. In the United States, it is called the Department of the Treasury. In the United Kingdom, Her Majesty's Treasury, or simply the Treasury. In other countries, the Ministry of Finance or the Finance Department, or some close variation on those words. The name is not especially important. What matters is the function. This is the department responsible for managing the government's money. All of it. The collecting, the spending, the borrowing, and the repaying. Within that department, there is usually a division, sometimes called a debt management office, sometimes folded into a broader budget or finance division, whose specific and somewhat narrow responsibility is the management of the national debt. The people who work in this division are not, for the most part, making large decisions about policy. They are not determining how much the government should spend on healthcare or defence or education. Those decisions happen elsewhere, in other offices through other processes. What the Debt Management Office does is more technical, more repetitive, and in many ways more quietly demanding than any of that. They manage the schedule of what is owed, the schedule of when each bond matures, the schedule of upcoming auctions, the schedule of interest payment dates, the schedule of refinancing needs 6 months from now, and 12 months from now, and 3 years from now. They look ahead, constantly, at the shape of the government's future financial obligations, and they make the arrangements necessary to ensure that when each obligation comes due, the money is there. This is not a glamorous kind of work. It does not attract much public attention, but it is work that requires a particular kind of sustained, methodical attention, the ability to hold a very large and complicated picture in mind over very long time horizons, while also managing the practical details of the next auction and the one after that, and the interest payment going out on Thursday. Let us walk through what that schedule actually looks like, in broad terms. At any given moment, a large national government has outstanding bonds of many different types, with many different maturity dates. Some are treasury bills issued 8 weeks ago that will mature in 5 weeks. Some are 5-year notes issued 3 years ago that will mature in 2 years. Some are 30-year bonds issued 15 years ago that still have 15 years left to run. These instruments were issued at different times by different administrations in response to different fiscal circumstances at the interest rates that prevailed at those various moments. They are all simultaneously in existence, all being tracked, all accumulating interest that will eventually need to be paid. The total face value of all of these outstanding bonds, the total amount the government has promised to repay across all of its outstanding debt, is what constitutes the national debt at any given moment. It is not one number from one decision made on one day. It is the sum of many thousands of individual decisions made over many years, each one a separate bond with its own terms and its own schedule, all of them now part of this single, very large, very slowly moving financial structure. Managing that structure requires knowing, at all times, exactly what is out there, which bonds are outstanding, what interest they pay, when they mature, who holds them, or at least what category of holder they are in, since individual bond ownership changes constantly through the secondary market. The Debt Management Office maintains this picture. It is updated continuously as new bonds are issued and old ones mature and interest payments go out. And from that picture, the Debt Management Office constructs the issuance calendar, the schedule of upcoming auctions, How much needs to be borrowed in the next quarter, and in what form? How much of that borrowing is to refinance maturing debt? And how much, if any, represents new net borrowing to cover a current deficit? Which maturities to emphasize, whether to issue more short-term bills or more long-term bonds, based on current market conditions, investor demand, and the government's own preferences about the structure of its debt. These decisions are made deliberately and according to stated guidelines. In most large economies, the Debt Management Office publishes its issuance plans well in advance. Quarterly updates, annual strategies, occasional consultations with major market participants. The intent is transparency and predictability. Investors who know what is coming can plan for it. Markets that can anticipate supply do not react to surprises. And a borrower who's seen as transparent and consistent in its approach to the market tends, over time, to be treated more favorably by that market, paying lower interest rates as a result of the confidence it has built. The interest payments themselves run on their own separate rhythm. Most bonds pay interest semi-annually, twice a year, on fixed dates. A bond issued in January might pay interest every January and July. A bond issued in April might pay every April and October. Across a portfolio of thousands of different bonds, all with their own payment dates, the Treasury is making interest payments on something on almost every business day of the year. Some days the payments are modest. Some days, when several large bonds happen to have their payment dates aligned, the outflows are considerable. The Cash Management Division of the Treasury tracks all of this, maintains sufficient liquidity on each payment date, and ensures that the transfers go out reliably and on time. A missed interest payment, or even a delayed one, would be a significant event. Not because the amount could not eventually be covered, but because of what it would signal about the government's financial management. The entire system of government borrowing depends, at a fundamental level, on the expectation that payments will arrive when they are supposed to. That expectation is built not through promises, but through the accumulated record of payments actually arriving on time, over and over again, across many years and many administrations and many different fiscal conditions. Each on-time payment adds a small invisible increment to that record. Each adds, in some infinitesimal way, to the confidence of the next investor who decides to lend to the government. It is a form of institutional credibility that is built slowly, in small units of reliability, and that can in principle be damaged much more quickly than it was built. This is one reason why debt management offices tend, by culture and by design, to be conservative institutions. Not conservative in a political sense. They are part of the administrative apparatus of the government, not participants in political debate. Conservative in the sense of cautious, methodical, resistant to improvisation. The default is to follow the established procedure, to adhere to the published schedule, to avoid surprises, to honor the obligations exactly as they were set out, on the dates they were set out for, in the amounts that were promised. There is a kind of institutional temperament that is well suited to this kind of work, and it is not the temperament of the innovator or the risk-taker. It is the temperament of the person who finds genuine satisfaction in a well-maintained ledger, in knowing that the columns balance, that the payments are recorded, that the schedule for next quarter is already drafted and reviewed, and ready for final approval. These are the people who keep the system running, not the people who designed it or the people who debate its merits, but the people who show up every day and do the particular and necessary work of maintaining it. And the system they maintain is old. Government borrowing, in forms recognizable to modern observers, has been practiced for centuries. The financial mechanisms that allow a government to issue bonds and sell them to investors, to take a promise and turn it into a tradable instrument, were developed gradually, through trial and error, over hundreds of years and across many different countries and cultures. Early experiments with government debt were not always orderly, not always reliable, not always honoured. The history of sovereign borrowing includes episodes of default and renegotiation and restructuring, moments when the promise was not kept, or was kept only partially, or was renegotiated into a different promise at different terms. But from that long and sometimes difficult history, the modern systems emerged. Systems with greater transparency, greater standardization, greater institutional infrastructure, auction mechanisms, clearing houses, regulatory frameworks, credit rating agencies, international conventions about how government debt is structured and traded. Each of these institutions and mechanisms exists in some sense as a response to a problem that was encountered somewhere, at some point, in the history of public borrowing, a problem that was studied and addressed and built around. The result is not a perfect system. No system of this scale and complexity is perfect, but it is a remarkably durable one that has continued to function in its essential form through economic contractions and expansions, through changes of government and changes in policy, through periods of high inflation and periods of low inflation, through technological transformation and demographic change, and all the other large-scale shifts that have reshaped the world over the past century. The debt continues to be issued, the auctions continue to clear, the interest continues to be paid, the maturing bonds continue to be refinanced, the schedule continues to be maintained, and somewhere, in a government office that most people have never thought about and will never visit, someone is looking at a spreadsheet, or its modern equivalent, that shows, in careful rows and columns, the precise shape of the obligations that lie ahead, the dates, the amounts, the maturities, the payment schedules stretching forward into a future that is, for now, still quiet and still manageable. They are updating a number. They are confirming a date. They are flagging an auction that needs to be scheduled for 6 weeks from now. They are doing the work that keeps the whole thing moving. And the night, for them, is just another night of careful, patient, unremarkable administration. There is a quality that government debt has which most other kinds of financial arrangements do not, and it is worth naming before we begin to draw this evening to a close. Government debt persists, not just for years, for generations, for decades that span the working lives of multiple cohorts of people, none of whom were present when the original borrowing decision was made, and some of whom may not yet have been born when the last payments on a particular bond are finally made. This is not unique to government debt. Some private borrowing also extends over long periods, but it is particularly pronounced in the world of public finance, because governments themselves persist in a way that individual people and even most private institutions do not. A 30-year bond issued by a national government will be serviced by that government regardless of how many elections occur in the interim, regardless of how many administrations come and go, regardless of the changes in policy and philosophy and political composition that inevitably accompany the passage of 3 decades. The bond was issued by the institution. The institution continues. The obligation continues with it. This gives government debt a particular relationship with time that is worth sitting with quietly for a moment. When a government borrows money to build a bridge that will carry traffic for 70 years, that will be maintained and repainted and eventually replaced long after the bonds that financed its construction have matured and been repaid. The borrowing is, in a sense, a conversation between generations. The generation that decided to build the bridge and borrowed to fund it passed along some portion of the cost to the people who would come after them. Not arbitrarily, not irresponsibly in most cases, but deliberately, on the theory that the people who would use the bridge in 30 years ought to contribute something to its cost, just as the people using it today are contributing through the taxes and debt service payments of the current period. This intergenerational dimension of public borrowing is one of the things that makes it philosophically interesting, even if we are not going to explore that philosophy tonight. The financial mechanics of a bond are simple enough, but behind those mechanics is this larger question of how the costs and benefits of public investment get distributed across time, across people who made decisions and people who inherited those decisions and people who will one day inherit the decisions being made right now. The debt that exists today is, in part, a record of decisions made by people who are no longer working or no longer living. It is a financial artifact of a past that continues to have claims on the present. And the debt being created today, through the bonds being issued at this week's auction, at the terms that currently prevail, will have its own claims on some future period, on some future generation of taxpayers and administrators and debt management officers who will service and eventually retire what is being borrowed now. There is something in this that resembles the physical infrastructure itself. The road built 50 years ago is still being driven on today. The bridge built in a previous generation still carries the weight of today's traffic. The water system installed decades before anyone currently living was born still delivers clean water to morning taps. The investments of the past are present in the infrastructure of today, and the borrowing that financed those investments is present, in some residual form, in the debt obligations that today's budgets continue to service. Public finance in this light is less a snapshot of any particular moment than it is a slowly moving record of accumulated decisions. Decisions about what to build, what to fund, what to prioritize, and how to pay for it. The current state of the national debt is the sum of all of those decisions going back decades, adjusted for what has been repaid, adjusted for the interest costs that have accumulated along the way. It is a very long ledger, longer in most countries than any living person's memory, longer than most careers, longer in some cases than the institutional memory of the organizations responsible for managing it. And yet, it is managed. Day by day, quarter by quarter, year by year, the auctions are held, the payments are made, the maturing bonds are refinanced, the schedule is updated and extended and maintained. The system continues to function, not because any single person or decision is sustaining it, but because the institutional infrastructure that was built to manage it, the treasury departments and debt management offices and auction systems and settlement mechanisms and secondary markets, has its own momentum, its own inertia, its own deeply ingrained routine of showing up and doing the work. This is perhaps the most important thing to understand about government debt as a system. It is not held together by any one person or any one government or any one set of decisions. It is held together by the accumulated weight of practice, by the fact that it has been done this way reliably and repeatedly, for long enough that the doing of it has become in itself a kind of assurance. The next auction will happen because the last 1,000 auctions happened. The next interest payment will be made because every interest payment before it was made. The next maturing bond will be refinanced because that is what has always been done, because the mechanisms for doing it are in place and the people who operate them know how to operate them, and the institutions that depend on it are counting on it. This is not a romantic picture, particularly. It is a picture of bureaucratic continuity, of institutional habit, of the quiet and somewhat colourless persistence of large administrative systems in the face of everything that changes around them. But there is, if you look at it long enough, something genuinely stabilising about that continuity. In a world that is otherwise in constant motion, economies expanding and contracting, governments changing, technologies transforming the way people live and work and communicate, the slow, steady rhythm of public debt administration provides a kind of bass note, low and constant and largely inaudible, but present beneath everything else. A vibration that continues whether or not anyone is listening for it. The bonds that were issued this week will pay their first interest in 6 months. They will pay it again 6 months after that, and again on a fixed and known schedule for however many years remain until their maturity. On each of those dates, a payment will go out from the Treasury to whoever holds each bond at that moment. Perhaps the original buyer from the auction, perhaps an institution that acquired it on the secondary market, perhaps a pension fund that bought it as part of a portfolio rebalancing last spring. The payment will be exactly the amount that was promised. It will arrive on the exact date that was specified, and the bond will continue, unchanged, until its final maturity date, when the principal will be returned and the promise will be, at last, fully kept. And then a new bond will have been issued with its own terms and its own schedule, and the process will have already begun again. This is the long, slow, repetitive, patient life of government debt. It does not rush, it does not startle, it does not resolve itself in a single dramatic moment. It unfolds across time, in small increments according to a schedule that was set in advance and that will be honoured with the kind of institutional reliability that is, in public finance, the closest thing there is to a promise you can count on in your sleep. Which brings us, quietly and without ceremony, to the end of tonight's narration. We have moved, over the course of this evening, from a road, an ordinary road, unremarkable, simply there, through the long and careful logic of how governments fund the things that are simply there, the schools and bridges and water systems and courthouses, the infrastructure that exists because someone decided it should exist, and someone figured out how to pay for it, and that payment stretched forward across years and sometimes decades in the form of bonds and interest payments and refinancing schedules and the slow, continuous work of the debt management office. We have looked at what a bond is, the three-part promise of principal and interest and maturity date. We have looked at how bonds are sold through regular and orderly auctions to the patient institutional investors who need exactly what bonds provide. We have looked at the secondary market that allows bonds to change hands between their issuance and their maturity. We have looked at the difference between a deficit and a debt, and at the long history that accumulates in the total weight of a nation's outstanding obligations. And we have looked at the people and the systems that manage all of it, quietly, methodically, without fanfare, year after year after year. None of this needs to be remembered. It was offered simply as something to rest alongside on a quiet night. The gentle machinery of a system too large and too slow to feel urgent, too familiar and too constant to feel alarming. Just a thing that exists, just a system that runs, just the sound, if you listen for it, of a very large and very old institution going about its business in the dark. This has been the Drowsy Economist. Quiet mechanisms, long cycles, the patient arithmetic of public borrowing. If you found value in this gentle exploration, whether for understanding or for sleep, please consider subscribing to the channel and leaving a like. It helps others find this quiet corner of the internet. And if there are other topics in economics or finance you would like explored in this format, the comments are always open. The bonds that were issued today will pay their next installment on a morning some months from now. The Treasury will have already prepared for it, the schedule will be maintained, the ledger will be updated, and somewhere, on a road that was built a long time ago and financed by borrowing that has long since been repaid, someone will drive home in the dark, not thinking about any of this at all, which is, in its own quiet way, exactly how it is supposed to work. Thank you for spending this time here, whether you're still with me or have long since drifted off. I hope you found the rest you came for. Sweet dreams and good night.